Hey, Gavin, Seim here, back in the studio, and let's dig into alchemy. I want to show you guys in depth what alchemy can do for you, how powerful it is, and just kind of how to use it and how to integrate actions with your workflow. You know, a lot of us, we use Lightroom, some of us use Photoshop, most of us use a little of both, and so workflow and managing the refinement and the retouching of our images becomes a really important thing. And that's what we're going to talk about here today as we look at what alchemy can do. So the first thing, of course, is to install alchemy, and it's for Photoshop. And you're going to take the actions you download and just drag them into Photoshop. And you can also load them from up in here as well. If you look at the menu, you can load actions from there and load the action file. And of course, you want the actions palette visible, which is going to be right here under the window menu of Photoshop. Now I'm in CC15 on this one, but it'll work in lots of versions as long as it's the full Photoshop, not Elements, because some of the tools and features we do in here have a great deal of power that you're just not going to be able to accomplish in Elements, just some different features and stuff. So we're going to stick with the high power stuff, and typically if I'm running actions in a workflow, I'm going to work in button mode. And so you can see you can run any action. I have alchemy loaded here, right? And I can click any action, and then I can go down here, and I can just click play and run that action. But I'm going to go ahead and switch over to button mode, because alchemy's been designed with workflow in mind. So once we switch to button mode, we see the colors, and we see the separate categories now separated out, and you can just do a single click. You don't have to push play or anything. You just click it. So let's take this one here, this nice portrait of Felicia. The light's a bit cool, and there's been really nothing done to this. This is pretty much straight out of RAW and taken into Photoshop. But of course, a lot of times we're going to be coming from Lightroom, having applied presets. Let's get a quick look at alchemy. The first thing you're going to see is some basic tools at the top, and these are kind of a carryover from our old Creative Essentials actions. And there's some other carryovers as well, but everything has been revised and updated and changed so that it can be more independent, more layer-based, so you don't have to flatten your images, all that kind of stuff. But in basic tools, you'll see a few basic workflow tools. One you may use the most often is a top layer from current state. And what this one does is no matter how many layers are in your image, it merges everything into one layer while leaving all the layers underneath it intact and puts one layer on top. So if you want to, let's say, you've done a bunch of edits and now you want to burn and dodge, you can do a top layer from current state, and it's going to make a new layer of whatever you've applied in the past, and you can now work on that layer. Now I'm going to get rid of this because we only have one layer on this image right now. But there's some basic tools like flatten all, expose, boost contrast, less contrast, burn and dodge layer, which puts a non-destructive layer that you can just burn and dodge normally onto, and it'll affect the image below without actually touching the image. And so it's kind of a non-destructive way you can do some burn and dodging and affect the layers below it without having to have a merged image to burn and dodge on. So that's kind of some basic tools you'll see, and we may be adding some more of these in future updates. Alchemy is designed for workflow. It's also designed for retouching. If you're into workflow, you're probably already using something like Lightroom, like Capture One, something like that. And honestly, if you're not, you should be, because for basic things like white balance, exposure, a little contrast, I mean, most of my work is done in Lightroom or in something like it. And yet, Photoshop is so important, because what we're going to see today is you can have an image that looks good in Lightroom, but then you bring it over, and if you say, hey, this is my one, I want to go to print with this one, you can do so much with it in the pixel level retouching. And Lightroom is really not a retouching tool. It's a general post-processing tool. Photoshop is our retouching tool. And so we get some basic tools, and then we go into the one-click alchemy. And again, some really powerful stuff here. And what you're going to find in terms of workflow is you bring your image in, and probably your exposure is good. Maybe you brought it from Lightroom or Aperture or Capture One, and you say, okay, I just want to refine this. What do I do with it? And sometimes this is a problem photographers will have, is an image looks great in Lightroom, and we say, well, what's it need? It looks fine. So a lot of photographers assume that there's no way to make an image better, and they just go to print with that one. What's always shocking, and I've talked about this in other workshops, is when you come into Photoshop and you work it over, and then you look at the difference, the before and after in Lightroom, it's not that it was bad before. It's that it's so good now that you're ready to go to competition. You're ready to hang it on the wall. And that kind of stuff is powerful stuff. And that's where alchemy really, really comes in. Okay, so one-click alchemy. These are kind of really versatile general use one-click effects. Now, it still leaves all the layers. You can still tweak and mob, but these are full effects on their own, okay? Then you get down into the brushes and the color mistings. The color mistings are really cool because you can see things like movable sunlight, where it actually takes and it overlays a light and a color. And what you can do is you can just grab it because it's an independent layer, and that's what's really cool about these. It's an independent layer. You move it around, then you can Command T, and you can resize it. So you can just drag it around and say, hey, I want to put some sunlight up here. And then, of course, you can adjust the opacity and all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but Color Mistings has stuff with colors, blues, greens, and then it has some auto tools down here that actually apply an effect based on the colors in the image. And there's a lot of that going on with some magic behind the scenes in Alchemy, where some of these actions will actually customize the action based on colors and selections it makes during the running of the action. And so it actually runs differently on every image. Really powerful stuff. And then, of course, we have the brushes, like for skin smoothing, for structure. Alchemy Eyes is one of my favorites because you can just jazz up the eyes really quick and easy. And then we have another category of one-clicks down here. And these are the bold one-clicks. And the reason there's two is just for the sake of workflow. Some of these are a little more intense. Some of your black and whites. Some of the classic effects coming over from Hollywood Effects and Creative Essentials that have been revised and updated for Alchemy. And just some really cool tools, but set up in such a way that you can kind of separate them from the everyday user tools that you're going to want to have. Okay? And you can, of course, move these around and do whatever you want with them in Photoshop. This is just how we've set it up. And then at the bottom, we have a few details tools. There's not a ton of these, but they're very powerful, starting with the dimension vignette and then a structure tool and some sharpening tools for getting ready to go out to web or to print or to competition or whatever it is you're doing. Okay, but let's see it in practice. We're in button mode. We see all the different actions and the different categories. Bottom line is, with actions, how do we think differently from Lightroom? In Lightroom, we're globally editing the image. And so if we apply an effect in Lightroom, and let's say it affects contrast, right? We apply a preset. And then we apply another preset that affects contrast. It overwrites that. It's not a layer-based system. It's a non-destructive single layer, essentially, with the exception of some of the basic local adjustment retouching tools that we have in Lightroom. But those are very limited compared to what we're going to see here in Photoshop. So why use both? Because you need both. Lightroom is not your retouching tool. Lightroom is your workflow and your post-processing. Photoshop is pixel-level retouching. So I tend to cringe a little bit when people get a hold of me and they say, well, I only use Photoshop, because if you're doing basic edits like contrast, like white balance, basic recovery of highlights and dynamic range, you can do that in Photoshop, but it's so much more efficient in a raw processor like Lightroom. Plus, you get to work directly with that raw file and get even more information out of it. Now we have an image and we're ready to refine that image. We bring it into Photoshop, and while the principles of image making and retouching are the same, what we get to do with it is entirely different because we're no longer limited by that non-destructive layer. See, with Seim presets like in Power Workflow, we've kind of revolutionized the presets a bit by doing the Pixel Forge preset. So you apply a global preset that, say, changes contrast, and it changes highlight and shadow and curves, right? And it changes pretty much everything. Well, if you apply another preset, it's going to overwrite the previous one in a program like Lightroom, in a RAW program, ACR, things like that. But what Pixel Forge did is it said, well, we can modify the presets we've done, and just adjust the curve now. So it's kind of like stacking presets. But still, if you apply a preset in Lightroom that overwrites a previous setting, it overwrites the previous setting. Not so in Photoshop. When we do something in Photoshop, it becomes additive. And so every time we add an effect, like expose, 0.25. Okay, we just saw we expose it just a little bit, right? Expose again. See, in Lightroom, if we clicked a preset that said expose 0.25 up, and we clicked it again, nothing would happen because it's a non-destructive. It does it once, and that's where that slider is now. There's no layers. In Photoshop, each layer, each segment, each action, each tool, each application is its own. And this can be incredibly powerful because we can build, and that's where Alchemy really comes in. You can just use a one-click, and you can say, hey, I want a little bit of glow on this. I'm going to run the Orton glow on it, okay? and we have a nice looking enhancement to this portrait. Maybe a little burn and dodge, we're ready to go. Really love this effect. But sometimes we want to go a little further. With Photoshop, you can do that, and especially now with Alchemy, because if we apply one effect, we can just keep going. And let me show you what I mean. Let's take this one. I'm going to apply the color sunset, okay? So here's a one-click Alchemy. Looks really nice. Now, when the action runs, you'll see down here in the Layers palette, you want that to be open. You have a ton of options, and one of the beauties of Alchemy is it always organizes things. It puts them in groups, it puts masks, all this kind of stuff. So what happens? Okay, well now you can click the action we just ran, and it puts it in a group on top of our original layer. And inside that, we can see all the layers that make it up. We're not flattening anything, we're not trying to hide anything from you, because we want you to go in there and tweak around. The possibilities with Alchemist, I keep calling it Alchemy, it's Alchemist, guys, is endless. Alchemist gives us the control, and we can say, hey, I want to dial back the color, maybe just a little bit too much saturation. So you can select any layer, and I want you to really remember this as you're running your actions. You can expand the group that makes up that effect, right? And it's a series of layers on top of the layers below it. You can adjust the overall opacity of the effect by changing the opacity of the group or the master layer. But most of the time in Alchemist, it's a group. You can also mask out certain elements. And if you don't know about layer masks in Photoshop, you're going to want to watch some training on that. But long story short, you have a white mask, which means everything is showing, okay? White reveals, black conceals. So let's conceal. I'm going to take the brush. I'm going to reset the swatches with the D key. And I'm going to press X to swap the swatches. Okay, so now I have black. I'm now painting black. Now watch what's happening. I can paint out an element of any effect or any layer with a mask on it. And you see down here, that's what I did to the mask. I painted that mask, which the black areas, they masked out this group, this effect, color sunset, on the image. But in that sense, it is non-destructive. We have layers, but if I mask this, I can reverse the swatches and now paint white. And you can see over here, right, when I flip the swatches back and forth, black and white, black and white. And then I can adjust opacity up here. So I can say, well, I want to mask at 50%. Because usually I don't want to completely mask it out. Generally, I just want to maybe diminish it a little here and there. And this is where you can get incredible depth and dimension. It goes back to the principles of the darkroom and burning and dodging. And we burn and dodge, of course, in digital as well. But the principles of masking are essentially those of burning and dodging. You can take a brush at whatever size or softness you want, and you can use that to mask in and mask out and get the effect that you need for a given image, okay? So I've applied the master sunset. Let's just keep going. Now, I've done a one-click Alchemy, and I say, well, it looks good, but this is the beauty of Photoshop and of Alchemist, because we can just keep building. I don't have to flatten the image. I can just keep going, okay? So I've done this. I'm going to add movable sunlight, okay? We see that here in the color mistings. So movable sunfire is a little darker. It's more orangey, and movable sunlight is more of a sunlight type glow, okay? I'm going to put movable sunlight on, and we'll see it's going to run, and it's just going to pop it right in there. Now, bear in mind, with the color mistings, one clicks are meant to be one click. If you want to leave them alone and run with it, they're probably going to look good. You can still mask and tweak. The color mistings and brushes, those are meant to have some user interaction. So it runs. Now I'm going to press the V key, which switches to my selection tool. And you can see that I can move this sun glow around. Now we have this fall color here, and I'm just going to enhance that light back there by bringing some of that sunlight and kind of spreading it just across her face. Now you see I'm resizing this. What I did is just Command T to resize. So I took this layer, which is the movable sunlight layer, and it also has its own mask. So I could click that mask and mask out part of this. I can adjust the opacity and intensity of it, etc. Okay, so here we go. There's our movable sunlight. Now, once again, with the color mistings, I'm going to do more movable. So I'm going to do a movable shadow, and I'm going to darken this tree. Now, yes, I could burn and dodge and do things manually, but again, this gives me retouching power with a workflow-minded approach, okay? And so I'm going to take my movable shadow. I'm going to scrunch it down a little so it doesn't touch your face. Again, I'm just resizing this and stretching it out and moving it around. It's basically just a misting overlay of well-blended paint, right? So we've done the hard work, the heavy lifting, the blending modes, all that kind of stuff is already there, and you don't have to hassle with that and manually paint it in. And that's where these color mistings, it's not that you couldn't brush this in manually, it's that they will save you a ton of time, okay? Let's do the movable blues. And so in color mistings, a lot of what we're seeing here is pixel painting type stuff, like I teach in some of my more advanced retouching workshops. We can see that I'm putting these layers on, and I can enhance specific colors, greens, blues, sunlight, foliage, etc., and get some really cool stuff going on. Okay, so as you see, and this is the beauty of alchemy, where a lot of actions have to flatten a layer because there's layer selections going on, and it has to select the background. We put a lot of work into making alchemy independent of the background layer. So it's just building up and adding on top of everything else. Okay, I'm going to do the auto highlight sun glow. Now this is one of those auto masking actions or auto selection actions, and you can actually see, if we click here, it actually made a mask and kind of automatically masked out to create the effect. Now you can still manually go over here and adjust the mask, but with some of these auto effects, they try and actually do the masking for you, so it's different for every single image. And what we see here, this one didn't do a ton. It just added a little bit of glow of light glow into the highlights, okay? If we disabled this layer mask, you'd see that it added a light glow all over. See, now it's showing everywhere, whereas with the auto mask, it's hidden. And maybe I want to show a little more. So I'm just going to take my brush, I'm going to lower the opacity to about 30, and I'm just going to brush a little more of this in. Just kind of bring up that warmth. Okay, now I'm going to continue with our color mistings. And let's do the shadow mister. Put that right on top just to bring a little bit of punch in. And I'm going to mask a little bit out here by painting over it with our black just to make sure we don't darken her face too much. And so we're just keeping building, okay? And let's do some brush in structure. So now we'll go to the Alchemist brushes, and I'm going to run the structure brush. And we're going to see that run. And again, we're just building on top of the layers. And so now I can add some structure in here. Now, I don't want to go too far because I might add too much, right? But I'm going to add some structure into the fabric a little bit. You know, just a little bit around her hands, the trees. Not too much. I'm going to drop my opacity down just so it's kind of nice and sharp, but not too much. Just a little here and there, lips, eyes, that sort of thing. Very general use tool that's very powerful here. Now I'm going to do the eyes, though, and I'm going to do alchemy eyes. And I'm going to run alchemy eyes, and then I'm going to zoom in nice and tight on this one as soon as that runs. Okay, here's alchemy eyes. Now, with the brushes, nothing shows to start with, and that's why you'll run the brush, with the exception of the autos, there'll be nothing showing, and you might run a brush and say, well, what happens? Well, you have to brush it in. And most of those actions will automatically select your brush and put it in the right mode. It won't change the size of your brush or the softness, but it'll get your brush up there and ready to go, okay? And you can, of course, change the opacity right here. And so Alchemy Eyes is selected. The idea of these actions is power but efficiency. If you want to go in and tweak with them, you can, but if you want to do them right out of the box, you can do that too, and you don't have to get carried away. So I'm just going to bring some punch into those eyes, and this is really good. It adds sharpness. It enhances the color. It's just a really powerful tool that kind of puts some light. It adds a little spark into those eyes, but I don't want to go too far with it, okay? And now I'm going to use the spot blemish brush, and that'll be the miracle blemish brush. And you can see we're adding a lot of effects. You don't have to use this many actions. You could run a one click and call it a day, but there's so much power to be had in doing this, okay? And so you can see, I'm going to turn the opacity up. This is really good just for, you know, if you wanted to clean up little spots and things like that, but you don't even need to bring out your healing brush. You can do it in a non-destructive way with this one here. And so that can be a powerful tool. And then I'm going to finish it off with the Pura skin brush, okay? Look, it's like a love-hate relationship when people want a smooth skin, right? Because we say, we don't want that fakey, ugly-looking skin that looks like plastic. And generally, your clients aren't going to want that. There's a time when you might want to do that. But generally for me, I want natural looking skin. The Pura brush is a really powerful skin brush that doesn't go too far and it's totally controllable. So I'm just going to brush it in at about 40%. And you can see that I'm just gently smoothing the skin, just taking the edge off of it, but I'm not destroying the features of her face and the details. Now, I could get pretty intense. You know, that's way too much, of course. And I could tweak with it a bit, but I don't want to do a lot. Okay, here's the beauty of this. So now we've masked in this skin brush, and let's just look at it before and after. It's always amazing how much you change something. You don't realize it because you're doing it incrementally, but how much you actually change when you go through the whole thing, okay? So now I can say, okay, I've masked in, I've brushed in the skin brush, but sometimes I'll go back and say, no, it's just a little too much. I'm going to dial it back a little bit. So I can take the whole group of Pura brush right here and all the subsequent layers that make up that effect, and I can dial it back. And so this is all stuff we don't get to do in raw processing. Look at all these layers we've built. We've built all these effects, and we still have control over these looks. And so we still have all our layers here. We still have everything right there at our fingertips. And of course, when you're done, if you want to save file space, you can flatten. You know, if you got a 16-bit file with all these layers, yeah, it's going to get pretty big. But when I'm doing the finishing touches on an image, I want it to be as flawless as possible. Okay, so now I'm going to do a burn and dodge layer on top of everything. Okay? And I'm just going to burn this down just a little bit on the non-destructive layer. Just darken around here just a little bit so she maintains the focus of all of this. And this is really for quick, gentle burn and dodge. If I want to get really intense with a burn and dodge, I would do a top layer from current state and burn and dodge that. Because if you get intensive burning and dodging, sometimes you can get into artifacts and things like that if you're doing a non-destructive layer. And so if I'm really going to do cool stuff and bring out the depth of the burn and dodge, something we discuss in the Retouching Magic workshop, then I might do that. But let's see what we did here in just a couple minutes. Now, this was a pretty intensive edit. We did a lot of effects. We came from here to here. Let me just show you that again. Here to here. You didn't realize we had changed it that much, did you? And that's how this always works. So you'll say, oh, it looks great in Lightroom, and then you go to work on it in Photoshop because the client orders a print or you're putting it in a gallery, something like that, and you start working with it in Photoshop. And because it's this additive layer workflow, it's just endless what you can do. And so you can still keep the natural feel of your image, but you can just keep working it up, and then you finish and you realize, wow, I went so much further than I had it in Lightroom. And I'm telling you guys, I do this every time. Every time I think, oh, it looks great in Lightroom, there's no way to improve it, I can always improve it in Photoshop. Now, that's not to say that I take every image. Lightroom is my workflow system. Most of the images never go into Photoshop. But if I'm doing something important with an image, if it's a featured image, if it's going in an art gallery, if it's going into my signature collection, landscapes, if I'm making a print for the client, at that point, I'm willing to spend some extra time. Because by having a good workflow in place, something we talk about in other workflow workshops, by building that super workflow in Lightroom or Capture One or something like that, and getting a speed down with the workflow so your base edits are all really efficient, now you have time left over to do stuff like this and to make the images really sing. And with Alchemist now, it's built into that same workflow mindset, those different categories of actions, the ability to quickly add things, modify things, tweak things. It's all right here. And it's very, very powerful. So just dig in, start playing with it, and just go to town. Because once you realize what you can do, you're going to be amazed. And Alchemist, I couldn't possibly tell you what you could do with it. Because it literally is a toolkit that you can build in any way. And you can see that with the way we did this. You know, we ran one-clicks, but then we added color mistings, we added brushes. And just to be clear, you could come back and add a one-click on top of this. Any action you run in Alchemist, it runs on top of the current look. So every action you've ran underneath it is visible, and it's just adding that effect as it goes forward, and you can build it up as far as you want. Now, right now, for the sake of demonstration, I've got these images in 8-bit mode, but even though it's slower, if you're doing serious editing for an important image, I would encourage you to run in 16-bit mode, and if I'm running from Lightroom or something, I'll open up in Photoshop as a 16-bit or as an 8-bit, I'll open as a TIFF or a PSD in 16-bit and edit that way. It can be a little slower, but the quality is better. It avoids artifacts. And if you're going to print, you want the best quality that you can get. And so you see here, we start with the basic tools. We have the one-click alchemy, which includes stuff for skin, stuff for landscape, just kind of classic soft effects, the Orton effect, just really versatile stuff for everything. Then we go into color mistings and brushes. Then we have some of the bold one-clicks down here, for things like black and white. Hey, let's just run the Lacreme infrared silver, because the cool thing is I'm not damaging anything, right? It's probably going to be pretty intense on this one, and I love the color image, but everything's modifiable. And so if I run something and it's not what I want, and this really does look beautiful here. This is one of my favorite black and white effects, is the Lacreme infrared. It's very punchy and contrasty here, but you can see it just ran right on the top. I'm just going to delete that for now because I love the color look. But you go through here, and then we finish it up and we say, hey, well, now let's sharpen the whole thing, or let's do a dimension vignette and just kind of darken those edges down a little bit like this. And let me just kind of refresh the screen there. And so there's the dimension vignette on top of that, but it's too much. I'm going to dial it back and just make a slight darkening of the edges so our eyes really go straight to her eyes. Our eyes should always go right to the subject, whether it's eyes or whether it's a mountain, whether it's someone's face, whether it's a family, whatever that subject is. And that's kind of what this all brings together. Okay, we're talking about workflow, we're talking about light, we're talking about tone, and we start in Lightroom, and we start in Camera Raw. We start somewhere, and then we bring it into Photoshop, and we want to refine. And ultimately, what we're always trying to do from camera to print is we're saying, this is my subject, and I want to tell a story about this subject, which means all eyes should be on the subject. I'm leading the viewer's eye. One of the things really powerful about pixel level editing in Photoshop and about Alchemist is you can emphasize your subject. Look at the way we worked with the light and the skin. We darkened some areas and brightened others. We brought light tones into the face. We brought a little sunlight glow in. All these things that we did were for the subject. Were to bring the eye into the subject. And that's the thing to remember. There's one subject in an image, and that's where you want their eye to go. Now, that subject can be a family of 10 people. That subject can be a mountain range. That subject can be this young lady here. If we know the subject, and we should really know that before we ever release the shutter, then we're carrying that through. We have a visualization in our mind's eye. We carry it through to the basic post-production, conversion of the raw file, because a raw is kind of like a negative. It's not a prepared print. Even a perfectly exposed raw isn't ready to go to print. It's raw. It's like a negative in the darkroom, and we had to manage the tones. We had to manage the colors. We had to get it to meet what we saw in the real world, what we saw in our mind's eye. And then we say, now I want to do my enhancements. I want to really fulfill my visualization with some fine retouching. And that's when I come over here into Alchemist. And the possibilities are truly endless. So we're going to do more. We're going to talk more about this, and we're going to keep working with Alchemist, because this is a foundational collection now, and we're going to start building on it. We're now taking on the extra dimension of retouching and workflow that we really can't get to in Lightroom. So for years, we've been making these Lightroom presets, and we had actions here and there, and Seim Effects actually started with actions. That's what got it all started for us, was making these quality actions. And then Lightroom came out, and we kind of started building into presets. But Photoshop, pixel level retouching like this, it never went away. I always used it here in the studio, and it took years of kind of planning and refinement and making a plan of how can I make an action set? How can we build an action collection that's a foundation that's meant to finish an image workflow in a way that nothing else can, but still integrate into that workflow, still give us the control. And we've really done that here. And you can see this in a few. I can't take the time today to edit every single one of these, but you can see with this, here's all these actions we ran on this portrait of my daughter. And so I'm just going to kind of click here and turn them off, because you see they're all still layers. So I ran the sun glow, I ran the alchemy eyes, I ran a classic soft lens, movable sunlight, dimensional vignette, brush in structure, movable rose for a little rosiness down in the dress, movable shadow a couple of times. And so look at this from here to here. It's a great image before. Now it's ready for print. Now it's ready for the wall. Now it's ready for competition. The same with this one. Really neat image out in white sands. But with a landscape especially, I want to fulfill the visualization. I want a natural look, but at the same time, it needs to be pristine. It needs to be beautiful. Didn't change a lot with these effects, We have 4 or 5 actions, a little blue enhancing, sun glow, misted contrast, just to kind of smooth out those clouds and that sky and give a richness to it. And so whatever it is that you're making, maybe it's this image of the espresso machine. And here's the final. What did we do? Well, we did spot blemish, contrast beauty, brush and structure, highlight brush. We went through and we enhanced with the structure the espresso. We used the spot blemish to smooth out some of the details and get some of the distractions out of the way. The highlight brush to restore some of those highlights. For a result that wasn't so different than what we started with, and yet it's so different than what we started with. And so there's a little bit of an overview of alchemy. Just start playing with them. And just remember that in alchemy, everything you do, everything you add, it adds a layer on top, and it adds the new effect. Then you can go over here to your layers panel. You can tinker with the mask. You can tinker with the opacity of the entire group, or you can expand the group and tinker with the opacity of individual layers. Now, some of the actions, like some of the color mistings, are just a single layer, but you still have the mask. You can still adjust the layer opacity. You can still free transform that layer by right-clicking or by Command or Control-T and resize your color misting. And so essentially, you're painting, you're building, you're making a visualization, and you're carrying that through into the retouch. And there's so much power in that. One of the things I'm super proud of in Alchemist, and this took a long time, is every single one of these, you can just add it right where you are. None of these things are going to say, oh, you have to flatten the image first. Now, if you do something and it doesn't come out, maybe you had a layer selected that's 5 layers down and you run an action and something goes wrong, just go back. Most of the Alchemist actions will self-rectify and move to the top. But occasionally, if you have a problem, you may find that it ran the action underneath some of the previous effects. Generally, I just try and have the top layer selected, and when I click the next one and just move forward from there. And if you're going through running actions one after the other, that's going to be happening anyhow because it's going to be the last layer selected. So generally, you don't have to think about that. But if you do have some issues where an action runs and you're like, hey, this isn't right, just make sure you are running it from the top, so it's setting it on top. It's building blocks to perfect retouching. And that's why we call this Rembrandt for retouching, because if you look at a Rembrandt portrait, his lighting, his details, and he was a master of the details. He made the image sing, and that's kind of what Alchemist is all about. We can make it sing, we can make it look the way we want, and we can make our viewers go, wow. I hope you love Alchemist. Let us know if there's anything more you need, if you need any help, and stay tuned because it's only going to get better from here. I'm Gavin Seim, and this is Alchemist.